The United States is preparing for a major war. Secretary of War Pidixet sees it that way.
A moment of mounting urgency. Enemies gather, threats grow, you feel it, I feel it. If we are going to prevent and avoid war, which is what we all want, we must prepare now.
Why has the Pentagon begun openly talking about war? Is this political scare rhetoric, or the result of serious strategic analysis? We do not have access to classified U.S. intelligence reports, but we do have another powerful tool: history. By looking at past conflicts and the patterns that preceded them, we can attempt to understand where the current trajectory may be leading. In this episode, we examine the warning signs that have historically preceded major wars, the role of propaganda and militant patriotism, the ambitions of individual leaders, and how the movement of armies toward borders has so often marked the point of no return. The first and most fundamental sign is the emergence of two states with roughly comparable economic and military power, but unequal status. In the 5th century BCE, the Athenian historian and general Thucydides argued that the Peloponnesian War became inevitable because Sparta feared the growing power of Athens. Building on this idea, American political scientist Graham Allison coined the term Thucydides Trap in the 21st century. The concept describes a dangerous dynamic. When a rapidly rising power threatens to displace an established hegemon, whether regional or global, the risk of war increases dramatically. According to Allison's research, from the late 15th to the late 20th century, 12 out of 16 such power transitions ended in war. A classic example is the Franco-Prussian War. As Prussia's strength and influence grew, a clash with France, then Europe's dominant power, became almost unavoidable. This same logic applies to coalition wars. When countries are not yet fighting, but begin forming military and political blocs, it is often a clear signal that they no longer feel secure and are preparing for conflict. Sometimes these alliances solidify only after fighting has already begun. One of the earliest large-scale coalition wars was the War of the Spanish Succession, fought between France and the Holy Roman Empire over control of the Spanish throne. Over time, broad alliances formed around each side, as other states sought to prevent any single power from becoming too strong. In the mid-19th century, the Russian Empire's attempt to gain control over the Bosporus and the Dardanelles, and to expand its influence in the Balkans and the Middle East, triggered a harsh response from the Ottoman Empire. Another Russo-Turkish war followed. After a series of Ottoman defeats, it became clear that Russia might achieve its objectives, and by late 1853, Britain and France entered the conflict on Turkey's side. The result was the Crimean War, one of the bloodiest conflicts of its era. World War I erupted because Germany and its allies challenged the dominant global powers of the time, Great Britain and France, while the Russian Empire confronted its principal rival in Eastern Europe, Austria-Hungary. Because these states were bound together by dense alliance networks, what began as a regional confrontation quickly escalated, drawing partners into the fighting and turning the conflict into a continental and eventually global war. In the second half of the 20th century, many prolonged regional wars emerged from similar dynamics. Both the United States and the Soviet Union repeatedly intervened out of fear that the balance of power in key regions might shift in favor of the other side. The Korean War is a textbook example. What started as a regional conflict rapidly became a proxy for a global confrontation. South Korea was backed by a United Nations coalition led by the United States, while communist North Korea was supported by Moscow and Beijing. A similar pattern unfolded in Vietnam. Yet the mere existence of two competing states or coalitions is not enough to trigger war. Conflict becomes likely only when tensions reach a point where they can no longer be resolved through diplomacy. In the early 20th century, the Entente and the Triple Alliance coexisted for nearly 7 years without direct fighting. But Germany's expanding imperial ambitions, its drive for colonies, raw materials, and new markets, fueled an arms race and turned rivalry with Britain and France into an irreconcilable confrontation. At the same time, Eastern Europe saw a steady escalation of competition between Russia and Austria-Hungary for influence in the Balkans. Gradually, the region became Europe's powder keg. By the summer of 1914, the atmosphere was so volatile that a single spark was enough to ignite the Great War. For war to actually begin, political leadership matters. Power must be in the hands of leaders who seek confrontation rather than compromise. Often, one such leader is enough. When they appear on both sides, the situation becomes explosive. In 1870, French Emperor Napoleon III sought to defeat Prussia, which he viewed as a direct threat to France's dominance in Europe. He enjoyed broad public support and deliberately pushed toward war. On the other side, Prussian Chancellor Otto von Bismarck was equally eager to demonstrate that long-standing tensions could be resolved with a single, decisive strike. The result was the Franco-Prussian War, a conflict that reshaped Western Europe by the end of the 19th century. In the late 1930s, Adolf Hitler relentlessly pursued what he called a small, victorious war to showcase the strength of the Third Reich. Yet the trauma of World War I made European leaders desperate to avoid another conflict, leading them to appease Berlin's demands. Hitler was dissatisfied with his bloodless territorial gains between 1937 and 1939, and was even frustrated when the Sudeten crisis ended in a negotiated settlement. By mid-1939, Hitler chose open confrontation with Poland, issuing demands that Warsaw could not accept. Poland's refusal of these ultimatums only encouraged further aggression. Notably, a significant portion of the Nazi leadership opposed war at that moment, forcing Hitler to act against the preferences of many within his own regime. Almost every party that advocates war promises its population a swift victory, minimal losses, and rich rewards. Occasionally, such promises are fulfilled. During the so-called Spring Offensive by the Communist Democratic Republic of Vietnam against South Vietnam, a rapid blitzkrieg led to a decisive victory in just 2 months. By contrast, Iraqi President Saddam Hussein failed to realistically assess his own strength and badly underestimated his opponents. He believed the invasion of Kuwait would go unanswered, dismissed diplomatic warnings, and ignored even the visible buildup of an international coalition along Iraq's borders. The outcome was decisive and swift. Hussein's forces were crushed, and Kuwait was liberated. One of the key reasons the tense standoff between NATO and the Warsaw Pact during the second half of the 20th century never escalated into open war was the absence of powerful pro-war factions at the highest levels of leadership in both the United States and the Soviet Union. Leaders on both sides understood that any direct conflict between Washington and Moscow would almost certainly turn nuclear and spiral into a global catastrophe. The Cuban Missile Crisis is a clear example. Neither U.S. President John F. Kennedy nor Soviet leader Nikita Khrushchev sought a direct military confrontation. Despite the extreme pressure and risk, both sides chose compromise over catastrophe. At the same time, history shows that mobilizing public support for war is rarely difficult. The formula is simple. Convince people that they are under attack, then portray pacifists as unpatriotic and dangerous to national security. This approach works in virtually every country. German Reich Marshal Hermann Göring described this mechanism bluntly to an American psychologist during the Nuremberg trials. This propaganda playbook has been used repeatedly throughout history. On the eve of World War I, newspapers across Europe were flooded with stories warning of foreign threats. Patriotic slogans dominated headlines. Calls to defend the homeland were amplified, and rival nations were openly demonized. German papers pushed anti-British rhetoric. French outlets fueled anti-German sentiment. Austrian newspapers demanded punishment for insolent Serbs, while the Russian press called for defending their brother Slavs. The result was an unprecedented surge of patriotic enthusiasm in every major power. When war finally broke out, massive public demonstrations in support of the conflict filled the streets of Paris, London, St. Petersburg, Berlin, and Vienna. Almost no one believed the war would last long. Most expected it to be over by Christmas. In the months leading up to World War II, Nazi-controlled media adopted an aggressively hostile tone toward Poland and Britain, insisting that Poland was preventing Germany from breaking free of an alleged encirclement. Tightened control over the press became a central element of the propaganda strategy. Journalists faced severe restrictions, and during the 1930s, the Nazi regime shut down roughly 4,000 of Germany's nearly 5,000 newspapers. There are also cases where, on the eve of war, the press does not prepare the population at all. This is often a deliberate attempt to conceal troop movements, especially from the future enemy. Prior to the invasion of the Soviet Union, Nazi newspapers maintained near total silence, leaving many Germans genuinely surprised by the attack on a former ally. Propaganda followed immediately afterward, reframing the war as Hitler's crusade against Bolshevism. Public opinion was rapidly reshaped, and large segments of the population came to support the war. General mobilization is one of the most reliable indicators that states are prepared to use military force. As a rule, once mass mobilization is declared, war is no longer a distant possibility. It is nearly inevitable, often only days away. In 1914, humanity encountered an unprecedented situation. Several major powers simultaneously placed millions of soldiers on combat readiness within a short period of time. In just a few weeks, Europe turned into a vast, armed camp. The logic was simple and dangerous. If the adversary mobilizes, we mobilize as well. This triggered a chain reaction. Austria-Hungary moved first, followed by Russia, Germany, and France. Within the first months of the war, more than 20 million people were mobilized across Europe, a scale that largely defined the extraordinary magnitude of the conflict. As a result, the economies, industries, and social life of all the warring states were fully subordinated to military needs. It was during this period that the concept of wars of nations emerged, conflicts in which not only armies, but entire societies became involved. On the eve of World War II, Germany announced general mobilization on August 26, 1939. Poland had already been conducting a covert mobilization, which was temporarily halted on August 30th in an effort to avoid provoking Berlin. However, on the evening of August 31st, conscription was declared openly. War began the following day. On September 2nd and 3rd, France and Great Britain introduced general mobilization and declared war on Germany. Another unmistakable sign of preparation for large-scale aggression is the concentration of significant military forces near the borders of a potential adversary. In early 1877, the Russian Empire began preparing for war with the Ottoman Empire, although Tsar Alexander II had not yet made a final decision. In March and April, Russian troops were concentrated in Bessarabia and along the Danube under the pretext of protecting Orthodox Christians from Ottoman rule. Diplomatic negotiations continued in parallel, but the more troops were deployed, the tougher the stance of Russian diplomats became, and the more aggressive the tone of the press. Eventually, the Tsar concluded that there was no turning back and declared war on the Ottoman Empire. At the beginning of the 20th century, relations between Russia and Japan sharply deteriorated due to rivalry over control of Manchuria and influence in Korea. In the fall of 1903, both sides began transferring troops and naval forces to the Far East while continuing negotiations. Nevertheless, in February 1904, Japan launched an attack on Port Arthur without a formal declaration of war. This marked the beginning of the Russo-Japanese War. There are other warning signs of an approaching conflict as well. These include shifts in trade flows and market realignments, such as the construction of energy infrastructure designed to bypass Ukraine ahead of a full-scale invasion. They also include mass civil defense programs, like those organized in Britain during the 1930s, as well as border provocations similar to those that preceded World War II or the Soviet-Finnish War. This leads to an open question. How saturated is the current international environment with such warning signs of a major war, possibly one even larger than regional conflicts such as the Russia-Ukraine war, Israel's confrontations with its neighbors, or the recent use of military and coercive instruments by the United States on the global stage?